Good morning. This is Chris Mark. It's a beautiful Sunday morning, 317. This is actually Scout Sniper Day for those that don't know, 0317 day. And I probably won't get this out till tomorrow, but I just want to say good morning. This is my first podcast in a couple of weeks. You can see I'm rocking the new green screen behind me. I'm actually wearing some headphones to monitor. I'm trying to get a little more sophisticated in life, get a little better quality of my podcast out, and so hopefully this one is a little better than my last. So this podcast is going to be a little more academic, risk 101, risk in life. Hopefully some folks will get a kick out of this one. This is actually what I do for a living. Is I talk a lot about risk, and I talk a lot about security. I've got some interesting anecdotes, some interesting stories, and I think you guys might get a kick out of this one. You can always read my musings on globalriskinfo.com. There's the address below, globalriskinfo.com. But we're going to talk about this. So, risk. Why do we care about risk, and what is risk? Risk is one of those things that people talk about every day. We use it every day. We use it every day. And even people that are not risk professionals, every single day you make risk-based decisions. May not realize it, may not even think about it, but you do. And for years I've jokingly said, parents, moms in particular, are the world's greatest risk managers, and I'll explain why. But before we get into that, you're probably going to say, "Hey, why should I care? And who is Chris? And what does he know about risk?" So a little bit about my risk and security experience, because you've heard me talk about being a sniper and things like that. So I've got about 30 years of experience in security and risk management. I've got an MBA, not a big deal, but I've got what's called, we kind of euphemistically call it an ABD, which is all but done or all but dissertation in cybersecurity with a focus on risk management, specifically Bayesian conditional probability theory applied in risk management. I was getting my doctorate, was completing a dissertation applying Bayesian conditional probability theory and risk management when life, specifically divorce, got in the way. So I did not finish my dissertation, so I did not get my PhD. In a very long time ago, I started life doing security and the Marine Corps doing security forces. And that kind of opened my eyes. As a scout sniper, I did force protection. I also did, as force reconnaissance officer. Kind of interestingly enough, I did security at a regional psychiatric hospital. If you want to talk about learning about security and unpredictable behavior, work at a psychiatric hospital. I did maritime security as a contractor. If you ever saw the movie Captain Phillips, I rowed ships and I had teams out there during that time. Very, very interesting times. I've done a lot of operational security, and for the last 20 plus years, I've worked in corporate cybersecurity and risk management, published about 30 articles in everything from the Counter-Terrorist magazine to Secure Computing, Pen Test magazine, been kind of all over the place, spoken at about 100 events. I'm keynoting a major event next month, actually in Las Vegas in April, and I've trained about 10,000 people. So, I don't know a lot of things in life, but pretty good at doing doing risk and risk management. And so when I say that moms are the greatest risk managers, I'll give you an example. I do a lot of training, and I'll say, if you're a mom in here, raise your hand. And of course, they raise their hands, and I go, when it's cold outside, what do you ask your kids to do? And they say, put on a coat. And I'll say, why? And they go, well, I don't want them to get sick. And I say, well, can they get sick when it's not cold outside? And they go, of course they can. I said, then why do you ask them to put on a coat? And, a lot of them had not really thought about it in depth. And they're like, well, there's a greater likelihood that they'll get sick if it's cold. And that is risk management 101, right? And so when we talk about risk and I ask people, what is risk? They haven't really put a lot of thought into it, but we apply it every single day. And we're going to talk about in real life why it's so cool. And I think you'll get a kick out of it. So, because anybody that's ever watched me speak knows that I love just pulling out tidbits of information and kind of, teasing people with it. So I live in Texas, and tonight they're going to have the next drawing for the Powerball, $645 million. So I'm going to be lining up like a lot of people. Now, I only play the Powerball once it's over $500 million, like a lot of people. because, well, being an amateur podcaster, anything above $500 million really is not going to fundamentally change my quality of life. I mean, I've got a new green screen I just paid, $150 for. So, anything over $500 million really doesn't change my quality of life. But what's really fascinating is people will not play the lottery if it's $1 million or $2 million or 10 million. But once it's approaching $1 billion, everybody's lining up to play it. And we're going to talk about why in just a minute. But if you look at the odds, and I can tell the screen's a little bit small here, the odds of winning the grand prize in the Powerball is one in about 292 billion. That's with a B, not an M. So one in 992.2 billion to win the grand prize in the Powerball for $645 million. Now, to put it in perspective, there are about 350 million people in the United States. So for every person in the United States, um, they could win 1,000 times. Every person would win 1,000 times before you would win one time. So but it's really fascinating when you see people lining up because they're like, oh, you know what? Now that it's $645 million, I'm going to play. But we're going to explain why. As the Powerball goes up, suddenly people want to play, and when it's lower, they ignore it. Jaws, boy, one of my favorite movies of all time. Probably dating myself here, but I actually went and saw Jaws in the movies. So my mother, who's since passed away, was a huge, huge, huge horror movie aficionado, and boy, she took it to see some inappropriate movies when I was a kid. One of which was Jaws. When it came out, I was a little guy, and I think it came out in 1976. I was probably like 6 years old, and went and saw it in the movies. Now, here's what's fascinating about Jaws. Jaws so terrified the public that 25 years later, 46% of people that saw Jaws still had a fear of going in the water because they were afraid they were going to get bit by a shark. Now, and ask yourself, how many people a year on average get killed by sharks? I can tell you because this is what I do for a living. I love stats, I love numbers, I love probability, I love all that. Roughly on average, 10 people a year get killed by sharks. Number one place in the world that people get bit by sharks is actually Florida in the United States. We have the number one, where the shark attack capital of the world is Florida. Now, the place where most people get killed is South Africa, bigger, scarier sharks, but have the most people bit. But still, it's only about 10 people a year are killed. But people are terrified of sharks, terrified, absolutely terrified. And we're going to explain why. And, I love referencing movies, and this is really the crux of why I decided to make this particular podcast. If you haven't seen this, and not to ever minimize, child trafficking or anything, I was having a discussion actually with my wife, and, believe it or not, the greatest fear of parents, the third greatest fear of all parents is their child being kidnapped. Third greatest fear, believe it or not, statistically. And this movie with Jim Caviezel is absolutely fantastic, and it highlights it's a true story about a law enforcement agent that is cracking child trafficking rings, right? And he goes down to South America, and I mean, it's absolutely heartbreaking, gripping, great story. And if you get a chance, watch it. But we were talking, and I've got a young stepdaughter, and she was talking about how it terrifies her, daughter being kidnapped, this and that. And I said, it's statistically exceedingly, exceedingly rare that will happen. And she goes, well, I watch a lot of Nancy, and she gave me approval to talk about this discussion. So I'm not throwing her under the bus. She goes, well, I was watching on Nancy Grace, and Nancy Grace was saying, and I said, oh boy, here we go. And again, it goes right back to what we're going to talk about in this podcast a little bit. And so she said, Nancy Grace said, she hears these stories. And again, it's the third greatest fear of parents. Well, believe it or not, it's exceedingly rare to have a child actually kidnapped in that situation. So I asked my wife, and I said, well, we probably should bury in the pool in the backyard. She said, why? And I said, well, the likelihood of her drowning in our pool is, pretty high. And I said, and she likes to eat steak. We should probably cut that out of her diet because the likelihood of choking on a piece of steak is about 1 in 3,600. And she said, "Now you're making fun of me." And I said, "A little bit." And I said, "We probably should get rid of those rollerblades because, chance of getting hit by a car on rollerblades is, whatever." And so, for those that don't know, the chance of being kidnapped in the United States as a child between 12 and 17 is, it approaches one in a million, one in a million. Okay. Exceedingly, exceedingly rare. But it's so terrifying to parents that they tend to ignore the probability, and we're gonna explain why. But, risk is it's funny, and, I love to reference books for a reason because it gives us a lot of insight into things we do. So, if you watched my podcast on gun statistics and gun reports and things like that, you'll remember that I brought up a book called How to Lie with Statistics. And anytime you see statistics, you really have to take them with a grain of salt. And you have to understand that anybody that's going to promote statistics, they have an agenda. They have an agenda. And so you want to be very careful about why they're promoting statistics. So, media reports that 460,000 children go missing each year. And you can see those missing and exploited children in reports like that. Well, that is true, but in what context? Well, it's a big caveat. So where this information comes from, in 2017, they started doing surveys, and it's actually a survey. So they sent a survey out to parents, and they said, "Has your child been reported missing for more than 1 hour for any of these reasons?" So the parents would fill it out and say yes. And some of them are like, "Did your child get off at the wrong bus stop?" Yes. Did your ex not bring them home on time after the custody weekend? Yes. Did your child, run away when they got mad at you, or whatever the case is, right? And they call those benign missing cases, right? It wasn't somebody maliciously trying to harm the child or whatever. It was a child either getting lost, getting off the wrong bus stop, whatever the case is. But almost universally, the kids come back home. So yes, there were 460,000 missing children for an hour or more. Almost without exception, they end up back home. But that does not include kids that were actually kidnapped, right? When we think about, the guy lurking that's going to snatch a child for nefarious purposes, or when I say the guy, but it could be a woman, but almost without exception, it is male. Um, when we look at that, we're only talking about 105 children per year. Now, this is a national statistic. I want to clarify that, if you go to the state level, you'll see some different statistics. And I happen to pull up Texas statistics just to understand. And Texas has a great database you can find online. And for child trafficking, sex trafficking specifically in 2023, there were 109 confirmed cases of child sex trafficking cases where the kids were actually taken in Texas and trafficked that were confirmed in Texas. Okay. So, but again, I'm not ever diminishing one child is too many. But when you look at it at a statistical percentage, again, 105 children out of 72 million children between the ages of 0 and 17 means that about 1 in 720,000 children, they have about a 1 in 720,000 chance per year in being kidnapped. Okay. So statistically, it's exceedingly, exceedingly rare. Now, to put that in perspective, when we talk about the sharks, okay, you have about a 1 in 3.7 million chance of being bitten by a shark if you go to the beach. Yet people are terrified, terrified, terrified of going in the water at the beach. Parents, again, their number three concern of their children is them being kidnapped. Again, statistically, it's exceedingly rare. If anybody remembers, there was a school shooting that was in the media back in gosh, I think it was 1999, Columbine. I'm not going to say the perpetrators' names. I don't want to give them the press, but it was two young men that were friends, had gone to the school, killed a bunch of young people. Um, After that, the year later, they interviewed a bunch of parents in the United States. Fully 60% of the parents felt like the likelihood of that happening at their kids' school was almost guaranteed. So when we start looking at this, it's a really interesting psychological phenomenon that happens. Okay, and we're going to talk about that. But before we get into that, I want to reference a book really quickly. So I want to reference again a book very quickly called Against the Gods. It's a little bit older now. It's by a guy named Peter Bernstein. It's called The Remarkable Story of Risk. Now, you probably have to be a little bit nerdy like me to think the story of risk is remarkable, but it talks about the history of probability theory and risk and what we think of risk today. And what's fascinating about it, so he tells a story in there. And before we understood things like probability theory and risk, when sailors were going to um, sail across the ocean, they would pray and think, well, if the gods are with us, we would make it. And if not, we wouldn't. And the world seemed very random and there was no rhyme or reason. You would either the gods were with you or they weren't, and the world was random. And at some point they started going, wait a second, it seems like at certain times of the year, the gods are with us more than they are in other times of the year. Well, of course, now we understand that, between June and November, we have what we call hurricane season, and probably not the best time to sail, and other times are better. And then, of course, where we really started understanding probability theory was through gaming. People wanted to learn how to win at games of chance, specifically rolling dice, right? And playing games of chance. So we started understanding that the world is not random and there is probability that goes into it. So this book really does a great job in explaining where we get probability theory and the idea of risk from. So if you do have an interest in that, great place to start to give you just a really cool background on where we get this idea of probability theory and risk from. So what is risk? And again, this is one of those things I ask people all the time, and I'm like, explain risk to me. Define risk. And if I were to ask 10 people, and I've done this, define risk, I'll get 10 different definitions. And I say, well, explain risk to me. And typically they're a little more accurate in trying to explain it than they are define it. So risk is what we call an artificial construct. So what is that? Well, an artificial construct, basically, it's a man-made way. It means it doesn't occur in nature. It allows us to understand things that occur in nature. So think about math, okay? Trigonometry, calculus, any kind of math. Math allows us to understand certain principles that occur in nature, but math by nature does not occur. Okay, it's a way that we can understand what's around us. Same thing with risk. It's what we call an artificial construct. So it allows us to understand certain elements of nature, but it doesn't occur in nature, if that makes sense. Biology is not an artificial construct. Biology is biology. Math is an artificial construct. It's a way that we can express what's going on. Now, denotation is a dictionary definition. Now, the reason I'm saying denotation here is because risk, depending upon how it's defined, it's contextual based upon the domain in which it's defined. So, really, the specific denotation we can say is the likelihood of an adverse action occurring. However, it is very contextual. If you were to ask a financial risk analyst to define risk, they're going to give you a different definition than an actuarial analyst in the insurance industry, who will give you a different definition than I would in the cybersecurity industry, who will give you a different definition than, say, a safety engineer. They're all going to be based on a couple of elements, and we're going to talk about that. So fundamentally, though, risk can be expressed. So notice I'm not saying define. I'm saying may be expressed as the function of the likelihood of an adverse event occurring, oftentimes expressed as a probability, and the impact should that occur. Now, you can express that quantitatively or qualitatively. So let me give you an example. Let's say that you have a house that is worth $100,000, and there is a probability that it will catch fire and burn down completely, total loss. There is a 1% chance that every year it will burn down completely and it would be a total loss. Okay. So the probability of that is 1%, total loss, $100,000. So the function, what you do is you take the probability 1% times $100,000 would be a $1,000 annual loss expectancy. So if an insurance company were to come in and please, if you're an actuarial scientist or in the insurance industry, I'm doing this just for generalization. Please do not beat me up on this. I'm not trying to give a class on actuarial science. It gets much, much more complex. So if a insurance company wanted to insure you, they'd say, okay, well, we estimate that you're going to have an annualized loss expectancy on this house of $1,000. So we're going to charge you a premium of $1,000. Plus, of course, we want to make a few bucks every year. So we're going to, whatever, upsell that for $100. So you got to pay us $1,100 a year to insure your house. Okay. So again, $100,000 house, we estimate that 1% chance a year, it will burn down completely, total loss. So the annualized loss expectancy would be $1,000 a year. Therefore, we're going to charge you $1,000 a year plus a premium. Now, that's a very, very simple way of looking at it, but in a very real term, you can qualify that. Okay. And this is what we do is we kind of go through life and we go, well, we think that there's a better likelihood or a less likelihood of this happening. And if this does or doesn't happen, here's how severe it will be. And if you think about the shark attack, people don't really look at probabilities. The average person going in the ocean doesn't go, well, there's a 3.7 million to 1 chance I'm going to be, or 1 to 3.7 million chance I'm going to be bitten by a shark. All they know is they said, man, I saw Jaws. And that movie terrified me. And the last thing in the world I want to do is get bit by a shark. And that is terrible to be eaten by a shark. So it doesn't matter what the probability is. I'm not going in the ocean. And so that's what we're going to talk about today. It's really a fascinating concept. So risk, again, is pretty basic. We do make these calculations all day long. And if you think about it, this is exactly what we do. You go out and you say, am I going to wear my coat today? Well, yeah. Think about rain. You look at the sky and you go, well, you know what? I live in Texas. Looks like it's going to rain today. I'm going to put on a raincoat. Or, well, I live in Texas. Who knows what it's going to do today, but I'm going to gamble. I walk outside. I don't think it's going to rain. Of course, it rains on me, right? It's a risk calculation. Now, in the case of whether or not it rains, really not a big loss. If I'm going on a job interview, the impact may be more severe if I don't put that raincoat on and I get rained on and now I'm showing up soaking wet. So again, the impact is one element and the probability is the other. And you calculate both of those. So there's another book that I like that was really interesting, and it's called The Irrational Economist. It's a little deeper. It's a much more academic book that you have to really get into. But they've got a quote in there, and I'll read it to you. I didn't put it in the slides, but they say, dreadful possibilities stimulate strong emotional responses, such as fear and anxiety. Okay, let me read that again. Dreadful possibilities stimulate strong emotional responses, such as fear and anxiety. And that's exactly what happens here is when you anticipate a huge impact, something really, really negative happening, whether it's being, bitten or eaten by a shark or your child being kidnapped, we tend to ignore the likelihood of that because it's just so over the top terrifying to us that we ignore the probability. It's called probability ignorance in a lot of respects. And I don't know why these slides have gotten so small. So the vividness effect is something that we have to be careful of. The vividness effect I talked about earlier. The Columbine shooting was struck the consciousness of most Americans so hard, and it was horrifying. And videos came out of it and everything else, and it stuck in Americans' minds so profoundly that a year later, most Americans, 60% of Americans, were saying, yeah, I think that's a high likelihood that will happen in my school. Let me be very clear here. I'm not ever discounting the tragedy of any school shooting. But again, statistically, it's exceedingly, exceedingly rare for that to happen. Okay. It really is statistically exceedingly rare. Vividness effect. Now, within politics, politicians love to use this on both sides, okay? And I have my own political leanings, but both sides of the political spectrum love to use this. They will highlight what they know will stick in your consciousness because they know that's going to compel you to vote a certain way. Okay. And I'll give you a quick example of that. Okay. So after 9/11, and there's a great guy, Bruce Schneer, who is a security absolute genius. He used to work at the NSA. He's got a blog called Schneer on security. He has written a number of books. Look him up. The guy has written his own, encryption algorithm. He is absolutely a genius on security. But he wrote a great article talking about security theater, about the TSA in the airports. And he's right about this. So we put all these, TSA agents in the airports with the intent of saying, hey, we're protecting you from terrorists. Well, statistically, we know that they have a very, very, very low likelihood of actually identifying weapons and capturing people that they should be capturing that would go through with ill intent, right? We know that. What they did, however, is they deterred a lot of actual travelers from flying by airplanes. People are like, it's so inconvenient now. I'll just hop in my car and drive. Driving by car is statistically much more dangerous than flying by plane. So what ended up happening is you had greater deaths, more fatalities because you had more people driving on the highway. So you had more people dying in auto accidents than we would have lost flying because of the implementation of these extra TSA agents, which didn't actually reduce the incidence of terrorism. And what it did is it kind of gave a warm and fuzzy to people that didn't really understand security or risk management. It was called security theater, but if you look at it, it actually had kind of a counteractive effect because what it did is we lost more people that were driving than we would have lost that were flying. So again, the vividness effect. When something really strikes at somebody's consciousness, it causes them to overreact in ways that sometimes are counterproductive. And then we've got what's called the neglect of probability, like what I was just talking about with Jaws. Um, and again, with school shootings, things like that. And if you saw my last podcast when I was talking about guns and stuff like that, people are terrified of AR-15s. In 2022, with all the gun murders and everything else, there were only 382 people killed by rifles of all sorts. 382 people in a country of nearly 350 million. 382 people killed by rifles of all sorts, AR-15s included. There were 600 people killed by baseball bats. So statistically, it's exceedingly, exceedingly rare. However, this idea of AR-15 strikes at the consciousness. So we have this what's called neglect of probability. We simply ignore the fact that it's exceedingly rare, and we just go, okay, we've got to get these AR-15s off the street because they're terrifying. Much like when I saw Jaws 25 years ago, and it's so terrifying to be bitten by a shark. I'm not going to go in the ocean. So, what's the gist of this whole presentation? Well, it's pretty simple. The reason that we need to understand probability and we need to understand risk management is because without understanding this, we are driven simply by emotion, right? We're driven simply by emotion. We pick up, or I guess we don't pick up the newspaper anymore. We read the news, and it doesn't matter what news you read anymore, it's going to be biased one way or the other. I don't think you can find any news source that is not spinning is some story, but you're going to read it. And if you don't read it critically with an understanding of some degree of understanding of probability theory and risk management, you're bound to be swayed by emotion as opposed to saying, wait a second, what are they really saying here? And again, looking at that, statistic, 460,000, children a year go missing. Okay, well, they do. They go missing for 1 hour. And the vast, 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 vast majority, I think 94% or more come back within, a couple of hours. And when they go missing, that's based on a survey of parents saying, yeah, my child, I called him in because I didn't know where they were for an hour, and little Timmy, got off at the wrong bus stop and I was terrified. Hey, I've got a son. He's special needs. He's autistic nonverbal. He went missing one day and his mom and I were absolutely terrified. And we lived up in the mountains of Utah and we had neighbor kids out on their little, motorbikes looking for him. I mean, we were all out searching, searching, searching. I mean, I was terrified. On the phone with the police. Everybody's looking for him. He was in the basement. He knew where a toy was and he was down there playing with the toy. But because he's nonverbal, he wasn't calling out to us. And of course, he's not worried. He's autistic. He was down there just having a grand old time by himself. I was absolutely petrified, right? So of course we called it in. He would have been one of those statistics. Now, was he truly missing? He wasn't, right? But he made it into that statistic as a missing child. Was he truly in danger? He wasn't. But again, when you see these statistics, you have to look at them. Without a knowledge of that, you tend to, again, be driven by emotions like we all do. So you have to always kind of keep that in mind. So risk management really is important just to kind of understand kind of what people are trying to tell you and what really is important. And it is kind of an interesting observation. I look things up all the time, and just as a when you look at some of the risks that are going around, for example, 38 kids died in bike traffic fatalities in 2001. 76 kids were hit by cars in 2021 and died, and that's tragic. As we all know, motor vehicle traffic injuries, the leading cause of death for kids, 0 to 19. I mean, it's really tragic. It just, you hear about all these stories, and if you want to know what are the other 1 in a million odds. So when we talk about kids actually being snatched and kidnapped, it approaches 1 in a million. So what are the other 1 in a million odds? Well, here's one. Of the next 24 babies born in the United States, it's about 1 in a million that one of those 24 babies will become a US president. That the next 20 coin tosses in a row, they will all come up tails, 20 in a row, about a 1 in a million odds. So if you want, you can actually try that. You can sit there and try to flip a coin. Odds that you will win the California State Powerball Lotto if you buy 6 tickets in a week for a year. So, hey, we've got Powerball coming up tonight. Probably not going to happen for you, but something that you can try out. So again, this is not, I don't know how long this podcast went, but hopefully it was a little bit amusing. Some of the anecdotes hopefully were amusing. Really appreciate you listening. And again, globalriskinfo.com. Appreciate it. Hope you like the new backdrop, and look forward to the next podcast. And if you have any questions, comments, concerns, recommendations for new podcasts, I am all ears. Thank you so much for tuning in. All right, bye-bye.